Right, so welcome everybody to this online event on climate sustainability in the academic system, the why and the how. My name is Astrid Eichhorn. I'm the speaker of the German Young Academy, die Junge Akademie, and I'm an associate professor in theoretical physics at the University of Southern Denmark. And over the last half year or so, it's also been my pleasure to chair the ALLEA working group on climate sustainability in the academic system. And to set the stage for today's panel discussion, I will give an introduction to the topic that will draw on some of the preliminary results of this working group. Before we get started, let me just remind everybody that this event is being recorded and that currently all participants are muted. You're very welcome to post questions. Please do so via the chat function. We will be taking those questions, as many as we can, during the panel discussion. And after the panel discussion, we will have breakout rooms in which everybody is invited to enjoy. And in those breakout rooms, you will, of course, be unmuted so that you can participate in the discussion directly. So now let's start with the introduction into the topic climate sustainability in the academic system. And the starting point is where we are now, which is in the midst of a climate crisis at 1.1 degrees warming. And at 1.1 degrees, the climate crisis is no longer something abstract that happens somewhere far away at the polar ice caps, but instead it's making extreme weather events more likely that we can see just in front of our front door, as wildfires in Greece and in California and the flash floods in Germany have reminded us last year. But there isn't just this anecdotal evidence for the extreme weather events. There's also the IPCC report that highlights that hot extremes, heavy precipitation, as well as droughts are becoming more likely across all regions of the world, with in many regions very high confidence of the human contribution to the observed change. So with this current situation in mind, I think it's pretty clear that we do not want to exceed the 1.5 degrees warming of the Paris Agreement. But what does it actually take to not go beyond 1.5 degrees? In its 2018 report, the IPCC has estimated that there is a quote-unquote remaining budget of 420 gigatons of CO2 emissions for a 66% chance to stay below 1.5 degrees. Those 420 gigatons are a bit of an abstract number. And to make it more concrete, it helps to convert that into a quote-unquote budget per person per year until the year 2050. And then it boils down to more or less 1.5 tons of CO2 equivalent emissions. And those 1.5 tons, those will be a really useful reference number to keep in mind when we next start to take a look at the climate impact of the academic system. So the ALLEA working group is looking at the climate sustainability of the academic system for various stakeholders. Those, of course, do include individual researchers and students, but also the organizations at which they work and learn, namely universities and research institutes, but also the larger framework of the academic system that includes funding organizations, conference organizers, academies and learned societies, and even more broadly ranking agencies and policymakers. We are looking at all of those actors both as individual actors, for instance, at individual universities, at individual funding organizations, but also we are looking at them as organizations that do set the framework conditions in which individual researchers and students act. And this double viewpoint, both on individual actors as well as on the larger framework, that is important because currently the academic system isn't climate sustainable. In order to become climate sustainable, I think it requires a cultural change. And to achieve a cultural change, individual behaviors need to change. This is where the individual actors come in, but also the framework conditions, the norms and the incentives need to change. And with this is where all of this research framework becomes important. And I will come back to this point towards the end of the presentation. Now, to give you some idea of the climate impact of the academic system, I would like to provide you with some data for universities, research institutes, and conferences. Starting with universities, an increasing number of universities is now estimating the greenhouse gas emissions, typically following the division as laid out in the greenhouse gas protocol, where scope 1 are direct emissions. For a university, that might, for instance, be a vehicle fleet. Scope 2 emissions, which are indirect emissions that are associated with the purchase of electricity and heating, and scope 3, which are all other indirect emissions, and that includes in particular emissions from the supply chain, as well as from business travel and also commuting. And here on the left-hand side, I'm just showing the self-reported greenhouse gas emissions of 6 universities within Europe, just as an example. And you can see that those are overall quite large numbers. The typical main sources of the greenhouse gas emissions, if you look across these universities, are electricity and heating. And that is unless there is a green provider or on-campus solar and wind, for instance. University of Ghent or Hamburg University have just a small fraction from electricity. This is because they have on-campus energy or have switched to a green provider. A second important source of greenhouse gas emissions for all of those universities, in some cases the most important source, is actually travel of researchers and also students. Now, comparing those numbers across the different universities is a little difficult for 2 reasons. The first reason is simply that they have and because they have different sizes, it just helps to convert to the average emissions per staff member. And if we then average across these universities, we end up with about 5 tons of CO2 equivalent emissions per year. This is very likely a very low estimate. And also the exact number, of course, can't be taken too seriously. It's just an average over these 6 universities, but with many other universities, you end up with numbers that are roughly within that same ballpark. And what that actually means is that it's above these 1.5 tons, sorry, that result from the 2018 IPCC report. Now, those reports here are, of course, the very first step a university needs in order to take meaningful action against its climate impact, simply because without the assessment of what are the largest sources of greenhouse gas emissions, it's difficult to take meaningful steps. But what you can see if you compare these different reports here is that different categories are being reported, different categories are being used. So there is currently a lack of standardized reporting. And this is the second reason why it's difficult to actually compare across institutions. And moreover, these numbers are all very likely low estimates because scope 3 emissions, in particular emissions from the supply chain, are typically very incompletely reported. Nevertheless, this already highlights that universities do currently have a climate impact that is larger than what we need in order to stay below 1.5 degrees warming. So let me then come to research institutes. And those are interesting because here we can see very directly what the climate impact of research activities themselves actually is. And I've just picked 3 disciplines just as examples. This doesn't mean that in other disciplines we cannot have greenhouse gas emissions. It's simply 3 disciplines from which there is some data available. The first is from astronomy. This is from a paper from the Max Planck Institute for Astronomy in Germany from last year. And you can see that overall these 18 tons of CO2 equivalent emissions per year per researcher, and then the comparison to also 42 tons per year per researcher in Australia, both of those numbers are very significantly above the 1.5 tons that arise from the IPCC estimate. And a significant fraction of that is flights to conferences, but also to observational sites. The second significant source is electricity. And here it's important to know that a very significant part of that actually comes from the electricity used in scientific computing. And so what you see here overall is not just the large climate impact of these research activities, but also that the main sources of greenhouse gas emissions at these institutions are very strongly tied to the research activities themselves. And this is, of course, what makes it so challenging to reduce these greenhouse gas emissions in ways that do not compromise the research quality. Now, a second example comes from particle physics. This is from the second CERN environment report. And I don't want to go into these numbers in detail. I just want to point out that of these approximately 200 tons of CO2 equivalent emissions that arose before the LHC went into a temporary shutdown, a very large fraction, namely this dark blue column here, comes from particle detection. And it's actually not mainly CO2, it's actually particular fluorinated gases, which have a very large climate impact compared to CO2, and which are actually necessary for these detectors to operate. So this is another example where the climate impact is very, very directly tied to the way in which research is currently conducted. And that is, of course, one of the things that makes it very challenging to solve this problem. The last example comes from the life sciences. So this is data from the EPFL, so in Lausanne from the Green Lab project, which took a look at the greenhouse gas emissions from 2 laboratories. And again, here you can see that travel is making up a very significant source, but also electricity, which in this case is also for many laboratories is actually goes very significantly into cooling to the low temperatures that are needed in mainly life science laboratories. And then a final example that comes from the area of medicine is an estimation of the greenhouse gas emissions connected to clinical trials. This paper from last year took a look at approximately 350,000 clinical trials that are registered in a US database and estimated that overall these are producing 27.5 million tons of CO2 equivalent emissions. And out of these, the current way in which clinical trials are conducted result in 20% emissions from air travel. So overall, what you can see on this slide are examples of a significant climate impact that research activities can have, but also that this climate impact is very directly tied to the way in which research is currently done. And that is one of the challenges. How do you reduce these emissions without compromising the research activities? Then the third example that I would like to highlight is one that has probably been in focus of the discussion most, which is conference travel. So to give you some numbers, this paper conducted a study averaging over a large number of different conferences, resulting in about 1 ton of CO2 equivalent emissions per participant from air travel. There are also many studies that look at individual conferences within different fields, and the typical number that comes out is roughly in that same ballpark. And again, it's useful to compare that to the 1.5 tons of CO2 equivalent emissions that are the quote unquote yearly budget until 2050. Of course, this 1 ton is an average across all participants, but really the emissions are unequally distributed across the participants. And often it's a very small share of the participants that causes a very large share of the emissions, namely those participants that have to take long-haul flights to get there. An obvious way to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions that we've all gained quite a bit of experience with during the pandemic is to switch to a virtual mode for conferences that is not greenhouse gas emissions free, because also our current Zoom meeting, of course, requires electricity to run, resulting in emissions, but a reduction somewhere in the area of 94 to 98% has been estimated to be possible. Now, even staying with an in-person conference format, a reduction in the greenhouse gas emissions is possible simply by choosing the conference location in an optimized way. So there is a paper that studies this for just 4 examples, estimating that even in an in-person conference, if you just choose the location carefully, you can save up to 20% of the emissions. Now, conferences are a very good example to highlight that transitioning to a more climate sustainable way of operating isn't just a problematic challenge, but it actually also provides us with opportunities to improve upon other aspects of the academic system. And a co-benefit that has been discussed also a lot is the increased inclusivity of virtual or hybrid events. And these numbers here make that very, very clear. They take 3 larger conferences of disciplinary societies. For instance, the APS is the American Physical Society. and compare the 2019 installments, which were in person, to the 2020 installments, which were virtual. And the thing to pay attention to is these gray parts here. The gray colors stand for regions in Asia, Middle East and Northern Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Latin America. And you can see that these gray areas, whenever you go from the 2019 in-person installment to the 2020 virtual installment, these gray parts increase quite significantly, which means that virtual conferences just have a much larger global inclusivity. Similarly, virtual conferences, of course, are more inclusive for participants with family or care obligations. And overall, the increased inclusivity is clearly something that benefits the research excellence. So here, in transitioning to a more climate-friendly mode of holding conferences, at the same time has a co-benefit that ultimately can result in the increase of research quality. Now, against the backdrop of those numbers that I've shown, it's probably not surprising that current trends are that more and more individual actors within the academic system are taking a look at their climate impact and are taking steps to reduce that. By now, more than 1,000 universities and colleges have given a net zero pledge, and this is just a very small selection of them, just to highlight that those pledges go across different scopes, but they also go across different times, and quite a few of them are actually net zero pledges for the very near future. However, this trend extends beyond universities, and just to highlight an example, within Germany, the Alliance of Science Organizations, which brings together many stakeholders within the academic system, namely the Conference of University Rectors, the National Academy, several science funders, and several associations of research institutes. This alliance has pledged climate neutrality by 2035. Then there are also many initiatives that come more, not so much from the organizational level, but more from a bottom-up individual researchers' action. For instance, within various research fields, there are now climate sustainability papers that chart pathways how these particular research fields or disciplines can become more climate sustainable. And of course, there are numerous initiatives to reduce flying in academia or to refrain from short-haul flights. Now, going beyond these steps that are currently being taken, what is next? Well, next is it's clearly necessary to go beyond initiatives by all of these individual actors and to think more systemically and start a broad dialogue with all of the stakeholders in the academic system to think about ways how to transform the academic system to become climate sustainable. And of course, such a broad dialogue is something that needs time and that needs multiple discussions. And we are hoping that with today's event, we can contribute a very, very small part to this discussion. If you would like to continue, then we would also like to invite you to the hybrid event on the 11th and 12th of May that will chart pathways towards sustainability and for which you can register now. And this concludes my introduction. I would now like to switch to the panel discussion. And before I do that, before I introduce our panelists, let me just give you a few housekeeping notes. So in order that everybody can see just the panelists on their screen and doesn't have a lot of videos of just the audience, if you're not a panelist, please turn off your video. And then when you go to the gallery view in Zoom, then you can just right-click on any participant that has their video off. And then there will be an option that says hide non-video participants. And this hides all the users with their video off. And then you will get a view which is more like a webinar view where you will just see the videos of the panelists. You're all very welcome to contribute questions to the discussion. We hope that we'll be able to take as many of them as possible. Depending on how many questions there are, we might not be able to get to all of them, but please do post questions in the chat. And the audience questions will then be taken in the second part of the discussion. After our panel discussion, we'll then move to our breakout rooms, and I will say something on the breakout rooms then. So now let me stop my screen share. And I would like to ask everybody who's not a panelist to turn off their video, and I think everybody has done that very nicely, so that we can now move on to our panel discussion. So with the introduction, I hope that I have provided at least a partial answer to the question why the academic system needs to become climate sustainable. I think the data speaks for itself there. But then the next question is, what does it actually take to make the academic system climate sustainable? And that's the question that I would like to discuss with the three panelists. So let me introduce the three panelists. So first off is Nina Marsh, who's head of the staff unit Internal Audit and Sustainability Management at the Alexander von Humboldt-Foundation, so representing funding organizations in our discussion today. As of 2022, she's responsible for implementing the Humboldt-Foundation sustainability agenda, in which promoting climate sustainability is and will be a central field of action. And Nina has over 10 years of expertise in the field of sustainability. She received an MBA with a focus on sustainability management in 2013. And in 2018, her PhD in social neuroscience, where she investigated the neurobiology of human altruism and how global crises influence the behavioral motives in our social brain. Also obviously highly relevant for the current climate crisis. Then our second panelist is Professor Carly McLachlan, who's the director of the Tyndall Centre at Manchester University. That's an interdisciplinary team working on policy-relevant research on climate change. Carly is also the associate director of the ESRC Center for Climate Change and Social Transformations. And her research interests focus on how stakeholders, including public ones, engage with energy and sustainability issues, and how evidence is actually used in this process. Her previous research projects have covered quite a range of topics, including setting carbon budgets and targets for cities, community energy, stakeholder assessment of carbon capture and storage. And her current research is primarily focused on how cities can drive climate action. And she's recently also been part of a team that produced a super low carbon roadmap for the live music sector, working with the band Massive Attack. So maybe there's also something for the academic system to learn from the music and art world there. And the third panelist is Henriette Stöber, who's a policy analyst at the European University Association's Higher Education Policy Unit, so representing universities and university networks here. Prior to joining the European University Association, she has worked at the Hungarian Rectors Conference and has spent a number of years at the German Academic Exchange Service, so DIAD's national agency for the higher education cooperation. She has also experience in working in the private sector in the UK, and she holds a joint master degree in European public policy with distinction from the University of York and the Central European University, then based in Hungary. And she's specialized in the field of higher education policy there. So I'm absolutely thrilled that these three experts have accepted the invitation to this panel, and I'm really looking forward to our discussion. As I've said previously, everybody is of course very welcome to ask questions by posting them in the chat, and the three panelists are also very welcome to ask questions to each other. Now, the question with which I would like to kick off this discussion is, for all three of them, if there would be one thing that you could name that you would change about the academic system to make it more climate sustainable, what would that one thing be? And feel free to name something either that you consider a very realistic next step, or something that you consider as a much more visionary next to step to take. Carly, would you like to kick off?
Sure, thanks. So I thought this was a great question to kick us off, and I had lots of things I might say, but I think particularly drawing on what you've already talked about, the thing for me would be that people, academics within the system who have great power to influence that system, recognise that and didn't talk about the system as if it was something that we didn't create. So, you know, we review proposals, we sit on promotions panels, we talk about what makes a good academic career, and we connect that with many things that are very highly carbon intensive. And the thing that I think could really unlock change is if you weren't sitting in rooms with people that are real leaders in their field and leaders in organizations talking about a system as if it is entirely separate to them, rather than that they reproduce and recreate that every day. And therefore, actually, they could start collectively, as we are here today talking about it, to disrupt that and to change it. And I think that could be really transformational.
Thanks. And so you mentioned this example of sort of individual behavior, and we will be coming back also to this aspect of sort of how do individuals and the framework conditions interrelate, and sort of what does it take to change both. But thanks for this sort of call to recognize all of our individual powers to implement change. Then Henriette, would you like to go next?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. And perhaps also linking a bit to what Carly said on leadership, I think I certainly would want to see more than one thing changed as well. But in order to do so, I think at the level of higher education institutions and research institutes, there's really a need for leadership to take and draft a holistic approach, a strategic approach to addressing environmental sustainability at the institutional level that really covers all aspects, you know, from day-to-day operations to, in the viewpoint of universities, all of their missions, research and innovation, yes, but also learning and teaching, and their role as an actor in their environment, in society. And in order to do so, I think, Astrid, you already hinted at it, there certainly is also a need to engage with all stakeholders across the board. This is certainly something that we found in a survey that we conducted recently with higher education institutions, and a lot of my comments today will draw on that one.
Thanks. And Nina?
Yeah, so referring to what kind of change I would like to see or initiate, I must say or admit that one important indicator for change is right in front of my eyes. So I joined the field of sustainability, as you said, Astrid, 10 years ago. And it has been such a niche that nobody would take it very serious, like on a level where we are discussing about practical implications. So to many organizations and their leaders, it was like more of a can and at best, but not a must. And so now with ALLEA hosting this event today, I feel very humbled also to see that so many people have registered for this event and take their time to join us, because this shows that sustainability in the academic system matters, and that we are really thinking about doing things differently. And so this is not only encouraging, I think, but also a first step towards a more sustainable future. So I would like to see this as a very, very sort of change that already happens. And it's more about what steps do we take next.
It's great. Thanks for all of your answers. Before we come to the steps that we take next, and there's of course also questions to address. There are quite a few researchers who may be worried about the negative consequences of climate sustainability measures for research. So let me ask, is climate sustainability actually in tension with research excellence and internationalization? So is it automatically something where we have to give up one or the other? Or is there a way to have both?
Do you want me to speak to that first?
For everybody, but feel free to jump in. Yes, Carly.
Yeah. So I think it's a real fallacy that we see it as this tension, and it gets us off on such a dreadful footing, because for people that want to be in this space talking about that's different. But in order to transform our sector more generally, we need to engage people where it's maybe not the first thing they're thinking about. It's not a huge priority for them. And if we start off talking about all the stuff that you've not to do anymore, it's not the most engaging place to begin. And I think that there is so much to be done that is about kind of, using our creativity, looking at these co-benefits that you flagged in the presentation, using the equipment that we have more efficiently, sharing our equipment better in universities, switching to renewable, high quality renewable energy tariffs. There's lots to be done that isn't about just doing less. And then I think when we are doing less, so if it's particularly about air travel, it's thinking about making sure that those are really high quality interactions, and that we really plan for them extremely well. You don't have to go very far in academia to have people talking about burnout and stress and how much they actually hate all the international travel they have to do. So actually, I think there's loads of space there to empower people to work in a different way that gives them better balance, does allow them to travel for really important high quality stuff, but allows them to deliver the really important stuff that they do in different ways. And we're no different to any other sector here. We have to put this at the center of what we do. And that's the only way that you'll provide a sustainable system, a sustainable provision of the services that we offer and the insight that we offer. And so that's a challenge for every sector. Now, if we don't have the skills in academia to work out how to do these things creatively, I don't know who would have it. You know, this should be absolutely in our wheelhouse. And so I don't think, yes, there will be areas where there's tension, but we're not saying no carbon. We're not saying zero carbon tomorrow. We're saying let's make some really chunky, immediate reductions in what we do. Now, if everyone has been making fantastic reductions at an institutional level for the last 10 years, it might be tricky because you might have already done lots of the things that are easy to do. However, I don't think that is what's been happening. So actually, there's a lot of stuff to do that is because we haven't been really actively doing this at an institutional level everywhere for the last decade. So I think there's so much to do that will have very little impact in that sort of tension space. And then once we do, that's about being creative and working in new ways. So I really think that we get off on the wrong foot by framing it as a tension right from the start.
So thanks, and the many great points in the answer. One that I would like to pick up to give to Nina is this empowerment of researchers to sort of make decisions about sort of how mobile they want to be. And of course, this is where funding organizations come in, right? Because on the one hand, of course, internationalization is one of those metrics by which researchers are being judged. The more international a CV, the better. This has often been sort of used as a metric, but also the Humboldt-Foundation has as its mission, right, to connect people globally and to send people out. So where do you see the role of funding organizations in exactly this question of sort of empowering researchers to make their own decisions about how mobile and international they want to be?
Yeah, thank you. And I would actually be fully on the track of what Carly said. It's about more empowering people than giving restrictions, because I often experience that we are talking about what restrictions we want to make. But I think in the first instance, we want to talk about empowerment. And I think for sustainability, this is really important to create a certain sensitivity for this topic, that everyone has a responsibility for him or herself, like on the individual level, but also as an organization. So, and as you said, we as a Humboldt-Foundation, mobility is a key topic for us, since we are a globally operating network organization. So we have more than 30,000 called Humboldtians from 140 countries that belong to our network. And our mission is to enable international research exchanges, and also promote an international understanding of cultures, and actually also in-person meetings. So this is why mobility is a key topic for us when it comes to sustainability, and we are very conscious about our responsibility to lead by example. And what does this actually mean, leading by example? For us, this means, first of all, that we are trying to find new ways to combine virtual and in-person meetings and mobility. So to really ask us the question, where can we establish virtual formats, and where do we actually need in-person meetings and mobility, like people coming together and meet, like people from the foundation, but also within our network. So this is one of the major questions currently, but it also means that we are doing an honest assessment in order to define our own ecological footprint, and not to make any beautiful numbers on how good we are, but to really look at the numbers very honestly, and then try to figure out where we can do better and how. But also, I mentioned it before, we are trying to create a greater sensitivity through empowerment among a various range of stakeholders, not only our employees in our network, but also our service providers who are working with us, for example, when organizing networking events, be it virtual events, because you correctly said you also have carbon emissions through energy use, and what can we actually do to come better in the future? And these are, I would say, the questions we're trying to, in an experimental way, find new ways to answer these questions for us, and not by assuming we can have a gold standard what to follow, but really what fits us, what is tailored for us, and what do we need as an organization.
Thank you. So Henriette, I would like to pick up on something else that Kali mentioned, namely that institutions haven't necessarily already taken sort of all of the easy steps and picked all of the low-hanging fruits. And that also picks up on a question that has come in via the chat from Jan Heidelberger, who writes that there might be many institutes and universities that set net zero targets, but somehow there don't seem to be too much action behind that at the moment. And so Henriette, you've done the survey of sustainability in European higher education university institutions. So what is your impression on how far universities really are in taking those first quote unquote easy steps and pick all of the low-hanging fruit before moving on to the more thorny issues?
Thanks so much. A very interesting question, even though I would also love to respond on the aspects of mobility and finding that correct balance, but perhaps we can put a pin on this one. Well, as I said, we surveyed around 400 universities from around the European higher education area in spring last year. And of course, as the survey was entitled Greening in Higher Education, this is a very self-selected sample and probably very biased, but amongst those, the institutions, indeed, I mean, the main reason was to collect information on what kind of activities they are already doing, how they frame it in strategies, and so on and so forth. And I think we were most surprised by what is actually happening in the area of learning and teaching. This is an area where universities really look into revising curricula, bringing in the topic into their courses. But then in terms of the net zero target, well, you're right, there's really varied activities ongoing, and for instance, screening the campus, screening the infrastructure. The feedback was certainly clear that the impact is not really yet seen when it comes to universities' strategies and what they are aiming to cover with regards to, for instance, screening their research activities. But I would also say that a lot of these, at least the strategic approaches that already have plans and review cycles in place, are actually fairly young. So when you look at the feedback of the institutions, is that they all have high expectations in terms of cutting down emissions, but also in terms of saving costs. For instance, leading by example came up quite often, using green credentials to hire future staff and attract future students. But this impact is certainly not clear yet, and they are not there yet. And when we asked them what are the next steps, what do they need? Well, funding came up quite often. Funding not only for greening their infrastructure or carrying out greening activities, but also funding in terms of collaborating and sharing with other institutions and stakeholders on good practices and through events and partnerships such as this one today.
So funding seems to be a key issue coming up, in that emphasizing again sort of the key role that funding organizations can play. And one of the follow-up questions I would have is, there are these aspects of the climate impact of academia that are very closely tied with specific research activities that I tried to highlight in my presentation, and where we maybe currently don't yet have any good solutions, and where we would actually need to research into what is a solution to continue running particle physics experiments, but in a less greenhouse gas efficient way. So that would be one aspect, but also the second aspect, how well do we really understand the data in the sense of what is the evidence base on the climate impact of academia? Do we have it understood well enough in order to take action, or is that also an area where we would have to fund some research? And this then goes to the funding organization. So do you see a role for funding organizations to very specifically incentivize researchers to think about their climate impact by opening calls that say, here's a call that is just specifically on finding solutions to make the academic system more climate sustainable? And that's a question primarily for Nina, but also to the others, whether that's a measure to trigger change or whether you would judge that to be less effective.
So I have spoken with some colleagues from the Alliance about exactly this question. So I know that we are asking ourselves the question, and of course what you said, creating special calls. For instance, the Humboldt-Foundation has, like, since many years, we have the International Climate Protection Fellowship, where we also started to compensate the air travel for our fellows since 2013. So there are, of course, solutions you can find for special funding programs, but for the research itself, I mean, we as a funding organization do not have that specific knowledge for any kind of research our fellows do, of course, because they are the experts. And what we can do, or what we are thinking about, is maybe linking, like in the application process, linking it closer to sustainability in order to create a greater consciousness about, like, asking applicants on what kinds of SDGs maybe their projects relate to, or something where we can show that we have a certain kind of sensibility towards that topic, which we carry forward to our applicants and our fellows. So this is a kind of way of thinking. We are currently in the very beginning, so where we have many experimental ways, and I would be very exciting. It would be very exciting to hear if somebody has already maybe experience with some kind of tools which are working and which are not. So because we haven't, we are currently exploring what would make sense, actually.
Yeah, Kali and Henriette, would you like to add? Yes, Henriette?
Yes, if I may add a perspective from the European funding programs to this. I mean, also here, there's currently a lot of trying out and piloting in place. You probably know, for instance, about the MSCA Green Charter that has been recently launched, I think about a year ago or so. An aspirational document, as I would call it, that really they describe it, I think, as a code of good practice, where individuals that receive funding through the MSCA program, and also organizations and institutions, basically have to say that they will try and adhere to the MSCA principles. And then there is a reporting stage at the end of the project funding stage. At the moment, this is really rather aspirational, but I think, as I understand it, there are plans to try and see how it goes, and maybe even make the reporting stage a bit more distinct and mandatory, introduce mandatory aspects in it. Another interesting example, albeit not the research funding programs, but still perhaps applicable in the future to other European programs, comes from Erasmus+. They're currently, for instance, in the student mobility actions, they now give top-ups, I think, of 100 or 150 euros if you choose a green mode of travel. They also allocate additional travel days if you choose a green mode of travel. And there's ideas around offsetting in the future, and so on and so forth. And while at the moment this is really just applicable to student mobility, there are indeed plans to introduce this to the entire program, so including the collaboration actions also by the end of the current program life cycle. So I think funding programs certainly can make a contributions also in the way that people travel or participate in these funding projects.
So yeah, I would just say that focused funding on areas where you really don't have a solution to get rid of carbon is a great idea, wherever you're doing that. And if that's partly in research processes, then super. But most of what we need to decarbonize, we already understand very well. And we don't need more research to work out that we need to decarbonize our campuses, for example. These are largely just challenges that every sector and every organization is facing. And so the funding challenge is, how do we do that? When we keep not putting a cost on carbon, so it's cheaper in the short run often to stick with fossil fuel intensive ways of doing things, how do we create models or adopt models, share models in order to make that transformation to a zero carbon campus? And I think there's lots of sharing that can be done across institutions there about how people are doing it, what new models they're trying, what kind of innovative finance models they're trying for that. But I don't think that's funding as in research funding. That's funding about like capital project funding. That is a really big question, and one that our heads of estates in all of our institutions are struggling with at the moment, but absolutely need to get on and deliver against. I think the funding side of it is much more, funding as in research funding, is what we've just been talking about there, about embedding expectations with applicants of what we want to see about how they plan their research. And I know that in some places they've gone straight to a kind of, we want to be net zero, so there'll be an offsetting element to it. And I think it's so important that we don't just run to that. It's got to be the stuff that Henriette's just been talking about, which is like how we expect you to do your research, how we incentivize you to take lower carbon forms of travel, how we look for those really high quality engagements. And we're not just going to be delighted to see in your bid loads of what you present as internationalization because you are moving yourself around the world, but much more creative ways to internationalize in a low carbon way. Let's make sure that's prioritized in the way that we assess proposals, so that that's what we bring forward and what we expect from people far before we get to anything about net zero offsetting stuff, because that is just a pathway to allowing us to do exactly what we're doing at the moment and buy some credits. So it's got to be about transformation, not about hitting this net zero idea.
Thanks, and we will also move on to this larger question of the sort of the systemic transformation that has already sort of popped up in several of your answers. But before that, I would like to pick up on this question of incentivizing versus maybe regulating. So, for instance, asking applicants to with their projects to point out which SDG goals, or in particular climate sustainability, how it relates to that. One worry that comes up from researchers in this context is, well, won't this interfere with our research freedom? So what is again the tension there? Is there a tension there? Is this really a problem, or is this sort of a false argument to all three of you?
I'll go first, but try to be quick. So I think we really need to think about what academic freedom means. And I would say it's about freedom of thought and what we want to explore and the conclusions that we draw based on the evidence. We are not allowed in our institutions to just do whatever we like in order to deliver what we think is important for research. There are all kinds of restrictions. There are all kinds of regulations that we have to follow to protect our colleagues, our research subjects. And this is an extension of that, to protect the environment and wider people around the world. And I think it's a false thing to include that the exact way you do your research is all part of academic freedom. I think the bigger issue for me, the more kind of stumbling block issue, is that, much as the hybrid working way or the virtual way of working can open up new audiences, I think there are situations where you might say that to mandate overland travel, for example, could be exclusive for some groups. And I think that's where we need to really work very closely with our colleagues that are looking at inclusion and diversity, to make sure that we don't exclude groups, particularly those that are often excluded in academic situations anyway. But that doesn't mean that you can't have guidance that is generally followed, and it's by exception that you would fly within a certain zone, for example. The other quick thing I'll say, after saying I'd be quick, and I haven't been, sorry, is that I think some of the conversations I've had around things like no-fly zones, for example, it's like we're really doing something incredibly innovative and new, actually loads of organizations already have these, and universities kind of are often talking about it as if it's like this super new idea that we'd say you can't fly within like the UK, for example, in our context. But actually many organizations just don't allow that already, and they've just done it on a kind of mix of commercial and moral, environmental reasons. And so we kind of need to catch up a bit on some of this and not think that we're reinventing the wheel when actually we're kind of catching up.
That's maybe also picking up on a point that came a little earlier, right? Whether the academic system can be leading this transformation within society, or whether this is an example where we are just lagging behind. But I'd like to also give the two others the opportunity to respond to the question on the research freedom and whether that is impacted by climate sustainability measures.
Well, I would just say it's like Carly said, it's more an extension of how you do your research rather than a restriction what you should do or should not do. So, for example, you also submit or have to submit ethical proposals to the IRB when you want to do specific kind of research. So. And it's not going to be judged in a way that, for instance, a funder would say you can do or you cannot do it. But in order to A, create a sensitivity, and B, to get a notion about how we want to do research on the individual level, but also on a organizational or in a cultural, like as you said before, the cultural change, I think this would be rather to see sort of an extension to what we already have.
Yes, and I certainly would agree with the other panelists on this. Honestly, when hearing this, I was almost puzzled by the connection between academic freedom and impeding academic freedom through environmental sustainability measures. I think at EOA we would rather try and see it the other way around and see opportunities for research and innovation from the topic of sustainability. I would not subscribe to that link at all.
Yeah, thanks very much for all three of you for this decided negative to this question. So I think that has very much to do with maybe the mindset that is represented on this panel and mindsets that are represented maybe also in other places within academia. And that brings us to this question of cultural change. And I'd like to pick up a question that has come in through the chat. So moving towards this broader discussion of what will it actually take to achieve this cultural change, both at the individual level, but also at the systemic level. And let's start at the individual level. So Louise Edwards is wondering that changing culture is very difficult because currently many academics see, for instance, travel as a perk and a status symbol. But more broadly, how do we achieve, very concretely, how do we achieve a shift in mindset? How do we take that next step to achieve that? And I'm just going to call on Carly to go first.
A big question.
Yeah.
Henriette, you put your hand up. Do you want to go?
I can start, I think. I mean, so how can you change or nudge individual change when it comes to travel? Perhaps starting a bit further back, or should we even travel? I mean, this is a discussion that we in Brussels hear a lot around student mobility, not so much around staff mobility, but perhaps the narrative connects quite nicely. I mean, we all know the benefits when we look at student mobility. When this takes place in a physical way, a lot of the benefits are from the immersion in a different academic culture and a different professional culture. And there are several pieces of research by the Parliament and the student unions, ESN, and so on, that really showcase that virtual ways of mobility or of collaborating just don't have the same benefits, at least when it comes to learning for the students. Now, if we would extend this to staff, I'm not sure if the same narrative would actually fit, but I think it's up to every individual researcher and every institutions to find this right balance, and I wouldn't have an answer where the balance lies really. However, in order to nudge individual change, it cannot only be up to the institutions to measure carbon footprints and perhaps pay for the offsetting, but they really need to also address staff. And I would like to bring forward a nice example that I really like to quote quite frequently in this context. It comes from a UNESCO project on green nudges. This has many interesting ideas around nudging individuals and institutions as well. One of the universities that participated there actually builds their staff for the offsetting of their travel. And so I don't know, this is probably not huge euro amounts that they receive as a bill on a quarterly basis, but I think to see it in an email or on paper, how much your travel actually costs, this might create change with some individuals for their next travel.
Yeah, I think we should remember that it's a recently created norm how much we travel in academia. This was not the case before cheap flights were available. So the sense that it's kind of always been done thus, that we traveled so much and we commuted to research sites so much, it's actually a very recent transformation of the sector, and therefore I feel that you can imagine that you could transform it again in a different way. A specific example of something that we're trying at Manchester University, where I am, I'm the academic lead for carbon, which is a job I sort of felt that, because I'm out there all the time with my research, talking to other people about how they could try and do this in practice. When I was given the opportunity to try and do that at my own institution, I felt like I had to take that on, even although I knew it would create sleepless nights and stressful meetings for me, and it certainly does. But it gives you that kind of empathy of trying to actually do this in the organization, which is what I'm doing with city authorities and things like that. But one of the things that we have brought in, we just brought it in, is to change in senior academics and professional services staff the responsibility to deliver on environmental sustainability in their area. And the acceptance that they'll get supported on that, they'll be expected to collaborate, but that it's everybody's job to do it. And I'm hoping that that will create kind of an unlocking of many people who are, just humans in the world who are worried about climate change and would really love to be feeling like they were doing something positive about it in their daily role, but maybe haven't felt like it was kind of quite their job, and wasn't that the environment department that are meant to do that. So that's one of the things we're trying, that's a concrete thing to try and embed a sort of higher level of awareness and responsibility. Maybe this time next year I'll be able to tell you whether it was successful, but that's what we're trying.
Yes, thanks. So if we now move beyond sort of the individual behavioral change, or maybe also ways of nudging individuals to change their behavior, and look at sort of the various stakeholders more broadly, then I'd like to pick up on a question coming in from the chat from Lucy Erber, who's asking, what role do students actually play in the sustainable transformation of academia? Henriette, you were nodding very enthusiastically. So
yes. I think from our viewpoint, students play a huge role. A lot of the feedback that we received from universities was that student initiatives were at least one of the driving forces behind coming up with a sustainability strategy at a central level of the university. We see interesting student initiatives around Europe, also dedicated specifically to sustainability, that carry out projects in order to make their universities greener, but also change approaches in all sorts of areas, including learning and teaching and third mission. So they do have a big role to play overall, not just students, but really also all stakeholders. And I think, Astrid, you already emphasized this also in your initial presentation. The successful approaches of universities that we see at the moment are really developing developed in collaboration with staff, with students, but also outside of the university with funding organizations, with the environment, cities, NGOs, and not just developed, but also implemented in that fashion. So absolutely important.
Yeah, I would agree that they're hugely important. And I think senior leaders in universities are very aware of the student expectation and pressure that either is or will be coming down the line. And I think that's one of the things that people that are trying to make change in institutions can use as a reason, that kind of reputational risk and the risks to student numbers and things like that. I also think they've played a really important role over the years at pointing out, kind of drawing attention to poor performance or hypocrisy in the sector. And I think there are many institutions who are a bit on thin ice with talking a lot about their research impact whilst not having a concrete, probably not the right term, plan for decarbonisation themselves. And, it just gets more and more untenable, that as a position to hold. And I think that students in particular are the ones most likely to be shouting from the rooftops and really putting pressure on about that in an activism basis, because they're coming through just expecting much more of us than I think we're generally doing. And I think they come to realise that we're there talking to them, working with them in courses about how important this is. It's the greatest challenge facing humanity. And then they say, and what are you doing about it yourselves? And it's like, well, it's really important that we continue to fly around the world exactly as we always have. And it's quite difficult if you've got to move people out of a building away from their experiments to retrofit it. Well, come on, we need to be better than that. We need to have more ambition.
Yeah, so I wish to add, they are the generation, right? So in sustainability, it's often about sacrificing today for future generations, and students and the generations after are the future. So they are incredibly important. Similarly is what Henriette said, not thinking sustainability inside a box and inside a silo within an organization, but the exchange of ideas and also involving the stakeholders, like understanding their needs also is incredibly important to develop on the route towards a sustainable future, I think. So stakeholders from employees to service providers to students, every organization has a diverse set of stakeholder groups, and understanding their needs would be a key issue to sustainability, I think.
Thanks. Yeah, so we've highlighted that students are one of the stakeholders within the academic system that could be really crucial to actually implement that change. But also beyond that, if we think about the systemic change, the cultural change that needs to happen, not just at the individual level, but really transforming the academic system, which stakeholders are the most important to achieve that change? What are the stakeholders that could really be driving that change beyond students? Or what are maybe asked differently, the stakeholders that are most responsible to trigger that change?
Well, I wouldn't necessarily say there is the stakeholder, but similar to that, I think every organization may find their own strategy how to implement sustainability practices. There are based on a stakeholder analysis, there would be one or two or three important stakeholders for an organization or for a specific sector. So I wouldn't necessarily say there's these stakeholders. So for us in the funding sector, there is, of course, important what comes from governmental direction too. We receive government money, which we then pass on to our fellows. So we are in ways also bounded towards what the government says and wants from us. So we are not free to do what we want, but we have also to focus on what they want. And trying to find ways how to realize our ideas. And that's kind of a tricky part, but yeah, I'm very optimistic about looking into the future in this respect. So yeah.
That's great to hear that there's some optimism around the topic. Kali?
Yeah, I was just going to add that in my context in the northwest of England, the local stakeholders are really important. We're a very kind of, like many universities, we're very situated in our place. We're very connected there, and actually our zero carbon commitments came on the back of the city adopting a more ambitious climate change commitment. And so then they worked with the key stakeholders, the main emissions creators in the area, to say, well, look, we're going to commit to this, but we need all of you to come with us. And the kind of very strange part of that story is that their original target came from work that was done by our team. So we did work around a carbon budget and what an appropriate target was to be in line with the Paris Agreement. We couldn't have gone, I don't think, directly to our leaders in the institution and said, this would be the right target for you to adopt, and kind of got anywhere with that. But because we worked with, a major organisation outside the city council and the combined authority, like the regional kind of council, and they adopted it, there was then a whole different set of stakeholders. So actually how these play out makes a really big difference. And it's those kind of stakeholders as well, when you're looking at connections in a place, that can potentially link up on some of this structural stuff about decarbonisation. So, combined capital projects in cities, in areas to decarbonise, where you can bring together the demand of different stakeholders to actually make this delivery on the ground, and you can work together to a common target. So I think those local connections can be super important, both in creating a kind of pressure and impetus, but also then in the collaboration to deliver.
That's very interesting. If I just may add, and of course I also agree with the previous speakers, I wouldn't identify one or two, three single stakeholders either. As I had previously said, engagement across the board is important. But as Nina brought up government, I just wanted to mention one more thing from our survey report, and that was the sheer absence, really, of people mentioning actually government as an important stakeholder, or the policy level as an important stakeholder. As a matter of fact, out of those that mentioned concrete legislation or government frameworks, the only consistent one was to be found in France, out of all the 48 countries, well, of the European higher education area that we could find, where there is actually legislation in the higher education policy framework that pushes universities to have sustainability officers in place, to have to come up with sustainability plans and so on. And therefore also in France, we really did see, for instance, that about 2/3 of the institutions actually have a leadership portfolio in place, so vice rector of sustainability, that actually concretely is in charge of that topic, and then also related staff power behind this to implement activities at the institutional level. And that was actually quite a surprise, I think.
Thanks. So I'm hearing agreement that a sort of a holistic approach that includes all of the stakeholders is really important. But then, very concretely, how do you get such a holistic approach and such a comprehensive dialogue? How do you get that going? If we consider the academic system just within Europe, for simplicity, not even globally, and say we now want to really make the first steps to transform that system, not just individual actors. Then at what level should that dialogue take place? What are institutions which can spearhead that dialogue? How can that be organized? I realize it's a tough question, but it seems to me if we think about sort of the next steps, sort of when the low-hanging fruit is picked, then that is what needs to happen. So how do we get there?
So I suppose I might come back to the very first thing I said, which was around the power that we all have, like maybe slightly unlike other sectors. Nearly everything that's done in academia has some element of people volunteering or sometimes being paid to take on responsibilities within other organizations or committees, or, you know, like people's, if you think about kind of where you can throw your net of influence, it's in all kinds of places for people. And I don't think talking about doing things in that environment is individual change. That's about using wherever you can stretch your net as wide as you can to create some change there. So, I mean, I started off talking about kind of particularly powerful kind of leaders who talk about this system as if it's separate to them and they're not the ones recreating it. I don't mean that they're the only ones with responsibility, but I think they have particularly big nets. And so they should use that wherever they can. But everybody can do it at every level. So if you're setting up a conference, you can think about whether that could be a virtual conference or at least have a virtual option. You can think about, you know, other people's guides to where you put it to reduce emissions and all those sorts of things. And that, I think that is what creates the structural change. Now, then you get like panels setting the rules of what they're going to fund, for example. And if you're sitting on the board of a funding agency, then yeah, you can embed sustainability much more in those processes. And that is structural change. So we are much more in control of the structure of our sector than many other workers in the sector, I think. And we need to embrace that and, you know, chuck our nets as wide as we can.
So advocating for the power of the sort of bottom-up process to structural change.
Sorry, just, I don't think it is just bottom-up. We are at the top of our sector. We run our sector. So it's not that we're like the workers trying to speak up to these people in control. We do all of it. So you need to change it at every level, wherever you can throw your net and join your nets together and all of those analogies. I won't extend it any further, but it's not just the idea of bottom up. It's more reconsidering how we think about what structure is, and that actually we create and recreate many of these structures, and they're not just something that exists separate to us that we need to wait for someone else to change.
Thanks for the clarification.
I would like to add, I think it's exactly like it has been for a very long time, it has been on the individual level, and it's only like this huge dynamic we face actually now, at least in our sector, is that it becomes more, there's a greater awareness in the boards and in the organizations themselves, so that we have what Carly just said, we have both. So the bottom up, which was there long before, like the individual who is doing sustainability stuff because he or she thinks it's like better for the environment. Whereas organizations said, well, if this is gonna happen, then the individuals have to do this. But that the organizations see that they have a responsibility too, and that they are much more powerful in placing products, in structure, in whatever kind of change they want to do. I think this is the dynamic we see over the past years, maybe. So, and this is where both come together, and where I think this could work, like working from bottom up and top down. So,
Marietta, would you like to add?
Sure, but perhaps just underlining what colleagues have already said, you know, in the end of the day, indeed, it's a responsibility. So seen from the institutional level, there needs to be connection to institutional values and the third mission that universities like to talk about. And change really needs to be done in a holistic way. I think it is really important to look beyond mobility and conference travel, which, you know, many of the discussions focus on these days. Collaborative approaches, that's another very important aspect. So not just top down, but also bottom up, as Carly said. And last but not least, perhaps also linking to leading by example, to communicate about the good practices, about new ideas on how to do things, even on the smallest level, that can be big steps forward.
And also, as for the organizational level, at least in my experience and speaking also to colleagues, it has to be like what we say in German, Chefsache, like it has to be in the like top of the board, you know. Otherwise there is no power. Like if I was in a certain department somewhere and want to do change within an organization, I won't have the power to do something. So it really has to come from the top. So as we say often in business, like tone at the top. And if sustainability is tone at the top, I think organizations are really powerful to initiate change.
Thanks. We'll now soon already be coming to the end of the panel discussion, and we'll be moving to the breakout rooms, where all participants are very much invited to continue discussing. And in the chat, there were a few questions or points that we didn't really get to. There was more questions on the question of academic travel. That tends to be, of course, one of the most contentious issues around climate sustainability. So the breakout rooms will be an opportunity to also discuss this further. But before we go there, I would just like to give all three panelists the opportunity to just say one or two sentences to close the discussion, hopefully with a hopeful message. But if you have a more pessimistic message that is meant to shake us all awake, then go ahead and voice your more pessimistic message. Nina, would you like to start?
Yeah, so I think in the face of climate crisis, inaction is not an option. So I think it requires the readiness to start walking, and I'm really excited to see that many, be it on the organizational or individual level, started walking. And my wish would be that we all have the courage to not freeze in a status because we think we have to establish a gold standard. It is less important to get everything right from the beginning. Transformation is always trial and error, and it's a work in progress. So far more important is that organizations and individuals are committed to do everything they can and sharing what they learn. So,
thank you, Carly.
I love that, Nina. That's great. I think we have this opportunity as we reassemble, as we come out of COVID restrictions, to keep things that we did differently that are lower carbon. And I think if we start from thinking about what could I do differently, right from where I was before, what did I enjoy doing differently, that gets us on our journey to thinking about how we can do things in a more carbon efficient way. I think there's a real risk if you go straight to the idea or you allow people to frame it as the idea that you'll be told you're not allowed to do anything, and you're not allowed to fly at all. And that is a tactic of people who do not want to allow this to progress. And I think they are rapidly being outnumbered by people in academia who want to do the really great stuff they do in a much lower carbon way. So keep throwing your net as wide as you can. And I think that this transformation is taking hold and is winning. And when we get a few bumps with people that are using these kind of tactics, we have to work together to try and get around them.
Thank you. And Henriette?
Yes, just very briefly, perhaps. I mean, from the viewpoint of EOA, higher education institutions and research institutes absolutely have a big contribution to make towards the goals of environmental sustainability. And we see so many activities already happening on the ground, small and large, and there's a lot of potential for improvement. But things have already kicked off, and we hope to see development in the future. This needs to be also really be reflected across all of the missions of the university. This is something that would be very important to us, not just in day-to-day operations or in this travel that the staff take, but also in learning and teaching and the third mission of universities. Thank you.
So thanks a lot for the three of you for your many thoughtful and inspiring contributions to the discussion. So we will now be moving to the interactive part of this event. And for that, the recording will be stopped when we get to the breakout rooms, so everybody can have a completely open discussion. You're also invited to turn on your video if you're in the breakout rooms. Of course, you don't have to if you don't want to. So for the breakout sessions, we will have one that focuses on universities and university networks, one on individual researchers and students, and one on funding organizations. So if you have already picked which breakout room to join in the registration, then you will be automatically assigned to that. If you haven't picked any breakout session, but you would like to spontaneously join one, you're very welcome to do so, and you will just have the possibility to select the session that you would like to move to shortly. And in the sessions, you'll meet members of the ALLEA working group on climate sustainability and the academic system, who will moderate the discussion there. And we hope that with the breakout rooms, you will have the opportunity to discuss further, but also maybe to exchange some best practice examples and just start building some networks within the academic system of people who care about this topic and who are interested in taking the next steps. So I wish everybody a very inspiring discussion in the breakout rooms, and I would just like to very much thank the three panelists again for their time and for their contributions.